Hi, Ryan.
Hi.
How you doing?
Doing great.
Excellent. Let me introduce us. I'm Robert Wright. This is The Wright Show, available in both streaming video and via audio podcast. And you're Ryan Holiday.
I am.
And you've written a very interesting book that I have not read, but I've listened to. So let me show people what it would look like if they got the audio book. It would look something like that. It's called Conspiracy: Peter Thiel, Hulk Hogan, Gawker, and the Anatomy of Intrigue. Really interesting book because, for a number of reasons. But, one is that I had read about the story. Most people have probably heard this. Hulk Hogan sued Gawker, ultimately put it out of business because it had run a tape of him having sex with his best friend's wife, which apparently you shouldn't do.
Right.
You probably shouldn't do either of those things, but certainly not publish the videotape.
Yes.
And then it transpired that Peter Thiel, famous billionaire, now famous for being a Trump backer, was secretly bankrolling the lawsuit. That's about all I had heard. And what's interesting is, as soon as you hear a story like that, if you're human, you start kind of making judgments about who the villains are, who the victims are, if any, in this case, I might say. It would be possible to just hear this story and think nobody deserves a whole lot of sympathy. But and you make those judgments, and then the more you hear, the more your judgments may change or may not. But your book reveals a number of things I didn't really know about this that did influence my thinking about and sympathy for and blame of various characters, and that was just a really interesting process. Did you have that consciously in mind as one dynamic that was going on?
I definitely tried to write it that way, if only because that mirrored my own process. So like everyone else, I followed the events superficially as they were happening, right? Thinking, oh, this is so strange. A professional wrestler has had sex with his best friend's wife. His best friend illegally recorded that. A media outlet ran it. He sued that media outlet. I thought that was sort of weird enough, right? There couldn't be more to that story. There's already too much there. And then obviously the idea of a billionaire coming in, that changes things. And then actually, reading the legal documents and talking to all the people involved sort of takes it to a whole other level, because first off, you can't talk to someone who would spend so much of their time and energy doing something like that and not begin to understand the sort of motivations that would propel them to do that, and the sort of real sort of human earnestness of it. And then on the other hand, you talk to the people whose lives were destroyed by what happened, right? The people who owned Gawker or the people who ran the article, and then you empathize with them as well. And so to me, what I really was trying to do is show what actually happened, right? I think in a weird way, it's been judged too much on both sides. So the sort of Thiel partisans presented as this deeply heroic quest, and obviously Gawker was this trash website that deserved to be put out of business. And then on the other side, the media has taken this as being proof that the entire First Amendment is in deep peril. And it turns out, I think, neither of those things is fully true. And so the book, I wanted to just present this, in some ways, just this insane series of events as they actually happened, in almost like a Shakespearean way, which is like just show these absurd characters. And I mean that in a good sense, like extreme characters is probably a better word, for all that they are, for better or for worse.
Okay, so let's kind of walk through the story, and I'll try to emphasize things that were news to me.
Okay.
Now, for starters, going way back, I don't know, 10 years or so, I guess, to Peter Thiel's original grievance with Gawker. Now, I had heard that, they outed him. He's gay. It was apparently something of an open secret, at least among people he knew well. But he didn't like it. But it turns out that, in a way, wasn't his only grievance. I mean, Gawker was a little hard on him in other ways.
Yeah, I think someone put this to me well. I wish I'd thought of it better when I was writing it. It's not so much that Thiel was outed by Gawker, but that they outed him as if he was ashamed of being gay, That the article presents it as if he is actively attempting to cover up his sexual identity because he believes there's something wrong with it. That's sort of the implication of the post. And in fact, Nick Denton, who's the founder of Gawker, is not only pushing the writer to write that story, but then comments at the bottom of the article, sort of, why has Peter been so secretive about it? What's wrong with Peter? Is sort of the tone of the piece. So Thiel reacts to that. But I think it's more that article is his sort of rude introduction, personal introduction into Gawker's MO, which is to find people who are different or weird or unusual or live out of the ordinary lives and find something to make fun of about them, or to make them into sort of caricatures in the professional wrestling style approach that was their editorial ethos. And so Thiel is one of, many dozens or hundreds of people that would fall into that sort of pattern for Gawker. And I think he was just the first to really not only to object to it, but the first to have really any means of doing something about it. And that's what sets in motion this unreal conspiracy.
Right. And we should say probably Nick Denton, the founder of Gawker, whom you mentioned, is himself gay, right?
Yeah. And not only gay, but also a libertarian, also an immigrant, also a technology founder, a contrarian in many ways. So it is very interesting just how, at least on the surface, deeply similar Thiel and Denton are. And that may have partly been what motivated the conflict at the very beginning.
Right, because Thiel himself is a professed libertarian.
Yes.
You note some arguable tension between supporting Donald Trump and being a full-fledged libertarian. But
sure.
Side,
that would be many years in the future, as at least as far as the conspiracy is concerned.
Yeah. And, we might as well mention that. It's an interesting word and an interesting choice of title. It does. I mean, originally, I wasn't sure why you had chosen it.
Yeah.
There were a couple of ways I came to understand how it made sense. One was actually kind of at the end when I don't know where it is in the book, but Denton is talking about, like, once he started having suspicions that Hulk Hogan was being bankrolled by an anonymous figure. I think what he says is he was a little careful to be too confident and assertive about that because it would sound like a conspiracy theory.
Yes.
And, looking at it, yeah, that's right. It would seem like that. If you say there's this dark, shadowy figure behind the scenes, but there's another sense in which it was a conspiracy. And this is one of the things I learned was that it wasn't just that, like, Peter Thiel heard about Hulk Hogan and said, hey, maybe I can help you out.
Sure.
Peter Thiel had well in advance of this come up with this. It's like the Normandy invasion. I mean, It was like he decided he was going to get Gawker. They started looking at all possible ways to get Gawker. And in fact, as they were bankrolling this lawsuit, they were also in one way or another assisting a number of other lawsuits against Gawker. So talk about that part of it a little.
Well, I think the fundamental tension in the book, and you picked up on it, is I'm trying to highlight sort of the difference between conspiracy theories and conspiracies. And, there are many ridiculous conspiracy theories out there, and even the ones that might be true. For the most part, we're just sort of speculating about them. We don't have a ton of, by their very nature, they are anti-transparent, right? And so this is one of the few where not only is it a conspiracy, but then the people who did it have admitted it and have explained exactly how they did what they did. And that was the particularly fascinating thing for me. I too thought, okay, Thiel was upset about what happened to him. And then this sort of Hulk Hogan thing just fell in his lap. And he said, oh, that's a better case than mine. I'm going to do something about this. But in fact, he had assembled the elements of this conspiracy for nearly a year before the Hulk Hogan tape was even run. And so it is instead that Thiel put the conspiracy into motion, which was looking for an opportunity to strike, and then approaches Hulk Hogan and says, you have a case here, will you let us fund it? And it, in retrospect, that case was the knockout blow. But they were pursuing a half dozen or so other cases at that time, and it just happened to be that the first case that they chose ends up being the winner. But the playbook that they had developed, they were going to run over and over and over again until they found a case that got them to the kind of verdict that they needed to force the site into either bankruptcy or being sold or ceasing publication. They were not looking to win money against Gawker. They were looking to fundamentally destroy it and force it to cease operations. And
this is what Gawker didn't totally get, because they had always settled out of court before, or else just gotten their opponents just tired and so now of course Thiel himself didn't approach Hulk Hogan because he was anonymous even to Hulk Hogan, right? And there is this important figure that you call Mr. A. You don't reveal his identity ever in the book. I gather that was the terms on which he was willing to talk to you.
Correct.
He's a young guy who approaches Peter Thiel, knowing about Thiel's Gawker grievance, and says, "I've got a plan."
Yes.
And it was more or less the plan they followed, right?
Yeah, so in a way, Thiel has pitched this conspiracy not unlike a startup idea, in the way that Mark Zuckerberg had come to him several years earlier and pitched him this idea for Facebook, which obviously already existed. But, Thiel is a venture capitalist, and so he's used to being pitched, and he can sort of see winners, I guess, when they're presented to him. So he ends up, Mr. A meets with Peter Thiel in Berlin in 2011, and he pitches him essentially a plan that's going to take 3 to 5 years and cost approximately $10 million, which is basically what in fact occurs. Thiel agrees more or less on the spot. And then so Thiel hires Mr. A, who hires Charles Harder, who's the attorney, who's now also Donald Trump's attorney, who then reaches out to Hulk Hogan. So Thiel is insulated on 3 levels here. And that is, I think, partly why this conspiracy is able to remain undetected for so long, is that there were these sort of chambers and not everyone knew what was happening in the chamber above their chamber. And so when I think about conspiracies now, like let's say someone's talking about whether 9/11 was an inside job or not. I mean, the amount of people that would be required to pull off a lot of the sort of so-called conspiracy theories is so preposterously unrealistic. What happened here was that they were able to set up an arrangement which not only involved relatively small amount of people, but then those people independently did not know who was involved.
Mm-hmm. Okay. I want to just pause here a second and note that you publish the Daily Stoic, right?
Yes.
That's kind of a newsletter, or I know you do like a Stoic kind of quote of the day on Twitter, right? If people, there's a Daily Stoic Twitter account.
Yes. So I published a book called The Daily Stoic, which is one Stoic meditation. It's original translations from the Stoics, and then a story based on Stoicism every day. Mm-hmm. Then there's also a site and a newsletter and a social media stuff.
And the reason I want to raise that is I want to ask, like, the question, what would Epictetus do, or what would Marcus Aurelius do? I think Marcus Aurelius may be your favorite. He wrote the most kind of accessible text on Stoic text. What would they have told Peter Thiel to do? Do you think a Stoic would be against his whole approach?
So this is something I've thought about a lot. And most interestingly, when I started working on the book, I spent one evening in Thiel's house and then another evening in Nick Denton's house. And on the shelves in Nick Denton's house were the works of the Stoics. And I actually know that he's read the Daily Stoic as well. So I think that there's a line in Marcus Aurelius. Marcus Aurelius writes to himself. Obviously, that's who the intended audience is. He writes, "The best revenge is not to be like that." So I think very clearly the Stoics are sort of anti-revenge. And then in Marcus's own life, towards the end of his reign, he's sick. The throne is in jeopardy, and his general, as some would say his best friend, a man named Avidius Cassius, declares himself emperor. So basically attempts a coup to dislodge Marcus. And so on the one hand, we have Marcus's sort of theoretical position on revenge. And then here is a sort of a grave betrayal where he would have had the opportunity to get revenge. In fact, at first, Marcus does nothing. He just sits there. He just wants to see how this will play out. I think his idea was perhaps he'll realize that I'm not as sick as was reported and lay down his arms and apologize. That doesn't happen. Marcus ends up leading troops against Cassius, but he says that he sees this not as an opportunity for revenge, but to teach the Roman people about how to deal with civil strife. So he actually uses it as an opportunity to sort of try to bind the country back together. Cassius is killed by assassins. We don't know if Marcus is involved in this or not, but the report is that Marcus weeps when he hears that Cassius has been killed because it's deprived him of the chance to grant clemency. So, and obviously this is sort of a trope in Roman history. Caesar supposedly weeps when Pompey is killed. But I think generally the Stoics would have been against it. On the other hand, one of Seneca's most provocative and interesting plays, Thyestes, is this sort of epic, disturbing story of revenge. So I don't know exactly what they would say, but I think being Romans, they would have appreciated the tragic elements of this story, but might have personally warned against engaging in it oneself.
Mm-hmm. Okay. So anyway, Peter Thiel doesn't seem to have very exhaustively considered the possibility of not getting revenge. I mean, he was pretty. In fact, are you aware of him? There's no hand wringing here, right? I mean, it was just a question of his finding the way to get the revenge.
Well, I mean, I think we could argue perhaps that between 2007 and 2011, he is considering not doing something.
Okay.
He ends up exploring options with a few people, and he said to me that it came down to either needing to do something outside the system or doing nothing at all. These were his two options. The sort of traditional playbook here, he said, there is nothing. Like, we've explored all the reasonable options. He actually reaches out to some of the people at Gawker. He sort of tries to ignore it. I think in his view, he felt that he had to choose between those two paths, and perhaps as to be expected, because it's Peter Thiel, chooses to do something and chooses to do the perhaps the least traditional of all the options.
Okay, so Mr. A gives him the plan. And by the way, you probably can't even answer this question, maybe, given the terms you reached with Mr. A, but I was just curious as to why he wanted to remain anonymous. It would be a good way to become very famous.
Sure. That was something I actually posed to him. I was like, if you guys are proud of this, why would you not want to say who you are? I think it's two things. One, I think he is sort of the definition of a behind the scenes guy. Like, I think what he likes to do is be the guy behind the guy. Mm-hmm. That's his MO. And maybe he thought there was a chance that he would never get outed, and this would always be, sort of his secret. And then there were some outlets that have speculated as to Mr. A's real identity. Mm-hmm. And so, again, not confirming or denying that they're correct, the person that they accused or pointed the finger at reported to that outlet that they'd been then receiving a number of death threats. So I would, at the very least, that might confirm one reason for being reticent about coming out. If whoever the finger is pointed at is then trolled pretty violently, maybe that would explain why.
And we should say, by the way, Peter Thiel's plan was to remain anonymous himself, apparently.
Yes.
He just confided in one too many confidants or something. For whatever reason, it came out, and we'll get to that as we proceed. But let's get back to, so Mr. A engineering this thing. They find a lawyer in, I guess, L.A., who's now represents Trump in certain matters. Yes. A guy named Harder.
Yep.
And and so they finally approach Hulk Hogan. Now, here's another thing I didn't realize. You know, when I heard, well, he was videotaped having sex with his best friend's wife, I thought, well, that's what he gets. I mean,
Yes.
and I assumed that one of the reasons this was painful for him was you'd rather your best friend not know you were sleeping with his wife. But
Right.
it turns out, I mean, tell us, it's bizarre.
So, I mean, it's even more bizarre than you just said. So first off, the best friend is legally named Bubba the Love Sponge. He's a Florida radio DJ who had a very publicly open relationship with his wife, a woman named Heather Clem, at sort of Hogan's, sort of a moment of weakness in Hogan's life. He, let's say, enters the open relationship, forgets there's no such thing as a free lunch, or that every offer has strings attached, and doesn't realize that sort of hidden in the smoke detector in the corner of the room is a night vision camera, because he has sex at Bubba's house, in Bubba's bedroom. And so this is
at Bubba's explicit invitation. I mean,
Yes,
I know you kind of said that, but let's be clear. I mean, Bubba, you know, Hulk Hogan is in this he's like really distraught over things that's happened. His wife left him or whatever, and bad things are happening with his daughter, whatever. And he goes over to his best friend's house for consolation.
Yes.
And his best friend says, you know, I know what you need. You need to sleep with my wife, like right now.
Yeah. And even if there weren't mitigating circumstances in the sense of like Hogan's personal life, it's consenting adults engaging in illegal behavior, right? So it's a consensual relationship in a private bedroom that he is not aware is being secretly recorded. And there was some debate later, like, did he know he was being recorded? But anyone who's watched the tapes or read the transcripts of the tapes, it's very obvious that he does not know because no one would behave this way if they knew.
Well, and in fact, after the sex, he starts pouring out his heart to Heather, and one of the things he does is repeatedly use the N-word, because I guess he wasn't happy with the way his daughter's African-American boyfriend had treated her or something, and that got him into a world of trouble. He clearly wouldn't have done that, I think, if he knew he was being videotaped. Yeah,
I think that's exactly right. And there's also an encounter in the tape related to those racist comments where after Hogan leaves, Bubba walks in and says to his wife, if we ever want to retire, all we have to do is use these tapes.
Right.
And so he's recorded without his consent. When the tapes begin to sort of leak out, the existence of the tapes becomes known. He says from the outset, if anyone runs these tapes, I intend to sue you. These were recorded without my consent. I've been horribly violated. And then Gawker runs them. They get 2 cease and desists, which they ignore. And then Hogan does sue them. And Charles Harder, who files the lawsuit on, with Thiel's backing, Thiel has been paying his bills for nearly a year at this point. He's a relatively unknown celebrity attorney in Los Angeles. He's sort of hungry. He's been in the legal profession for something like 20 years, but he is not like one of those sort of top level alpha dog lawyers. This is kind of when he ascends the steps of the Florida courthouse and files a lawsuit, people are just sort of like, who is this guy? We've never seen this person before. And why is he representing Hulk Hogan? But everyone sort of forgets this, and it just they don't really realize just how formidable an opponent they happen to have made here.
Right.
Or the level of his backing, obviously.
Yeah. And, on the subject of how the videotapes came out, so Bubba the Love Sponge recorded them. And I got to say, if there's one figure in the book who I don't think at any point I am given reason to have sympathy for, it's Bubba the Love Sponge. I mean, I'm sure there's a soft side, and maybe that's why they call him the Love Sponge. But, of course, he's a famously provocative, to put it mildly, shock jock, right? I mean, he once slaughtered an animal during a radio thing or something.
He did, yes.
But anyway, and I'm curious, do they know that he is not the one who released the tapes? The story is that the tapes, he wound up divorcing his wife, and their furniture wound up going who knows where, and in some drawer there were these tapes. Do we know because there's another weird thing, which is that during all of this, before the thing has come to trial, an attorney gets in touch with Hulk Hogan and says, we have the tapes and we have the part where you use the N-word and so on. We have the whole thing and we want money to give you the tapes. And I was thinking, how do we know that's not Bubba the Love Sponge? And how do we know that he's not the one who leaked them in any event?
So I feel somewhat strange going into this level of detail on your show because I know you usually talk about much smarter topics, but it is an insane series of events. So this entire conspiracy, this entire sort of in some ways world-changing set of events is put in motion not just because Bubba the Love Sponge, has this open relationship with his wife and has this weird perversion where he likes to record her having sex with other men, but the tapes come up in his divorce with his wife as communal property. He gets the tapes and he locks them in a drawer in his desk at his office. And as far as we know, and no one has been charged with this crime, so this is somewhat speculative, but I spoke with Bubba the Love Sponge actually just a few weeks ago. He had me on his radio show, of all things.
He can do, I guess.
Yeah, and this is confirmed by police reports and police investigations at the time. The going suspicion is that a rival DJ at Bubba's radio station that previously worked for Bubba that was seeking to displace him from his morning slot steals the tapes, begins to leak them to media outlets to embarrass Bubba, not Hogan. Hogan is actually not the intended target originally, but to embarrass Bubba
although he's the one they try to extort, or somebody who's in possession of the tapes tries to extort.
So first, the leaking is just to expose Bubba as a cuck, right? The word that would later become famous.
Isn't it? Humiliate him because his wife was having sex with another man.
Yes. And then it becomes clear that the tapes may have some value, right? At some point during the leaking process, the person who stole the tapes is connected with a lawyer in Los Angeles, a man named Keith M. Davidson, and I'll return to him in a second because that name might sound familiar to people. But that lawyer reaches out to Hogan after the Gawker story runs and says, look, we are in possession of 2 other tapes. Would you like to purchase them? Hogan contacts the FBI. A sting is set up with which to buy these tapes. Both Davidson and his client are arrested in a Florida hotel room attempting to sell these tapes. There's a recording of all of it. It's pretty incredible. No charges are ultimately filed,
which is very strange, and we don't know why.
It's very strange, and this is where it gets stranger. Davidson is also the attorney who approaches a man named Donald J. Trump in 2016 with word of a similar embarrassing set of materials. In this case, the recountings of an evening spent with Stormy Daniels, and brokers her silence with Michael Cohen. So this is essentially Davidson's MO, is that he sells, he essentially uses the legal profession as a sort of legal form of extortion against famous or well-known people. And so it's interesting, in 2012, the FBI had Davidson in custody on camera doing this thing. So all of Trump's criticisms of the FBI, of which I think are mostly illegitimate, his legitimate criticism would be that they had the man who later extorted him in custody, and had they done their job, we would not know the name Stormy Daniels.
Although maybe, that the guy's a lawyer and he's careful enough to not technically commit extortion. Maybe the FBI just realized they didn't have a case because of the exact way he had phrased things and handled things.
I think that's partly it, and I think also it's just a deeply unpleasant. I think this is not why anyone becomes a prosecutor, a federal prosecutor, or an FBI agent, to get in the middle of somebody's open marriage, recordings. I think there is no real clear reason why the case was not followed up or prosecuted. It is sort of one of the giant mysteries in this whole thing. It's just incredibly strange, the amount of people that became sort of tied up in this whole thing.
Yeah, and the various different kinds of Trump connections are a little odd
unreal.
Too. Quick question before we proceed to the trial.
Yes.
It's not unrelated to Trump. Is there do you have any sense that maybe the process of doing this kind of steered Peter Thiel toward the alt-right? I just noticed that in the course of the thing, he finds himself in league with some people. In the course of it attacking Gawker, he finds himself in league, as I understand it, with the alt-right people in the Gamergate scandal. Yes. Because I didn't realize, but I guess Gawker was a big kind of initial target of that. They were complaining about a review, something involving Gawker. And then this guy, Chuck, what's his name? This kind of really noxious.
Chuck Johnson, yeah.
Chuck Johnson makes an appearance.
Yes.
So I mean, did Peter Thiel first start getting kind of drawn into Trump's constituency via this?
I think so. You know, it was sort of an element of the enemy of my enemy is my friend. And it was also that Gamergate sort of happens in 2014. You know, this conspiracy is well underway, but then Gawker sort of steps on this landmine with these this internet mob over some, I think, relatively trumped up or strange series of grievances. But it's that same sort of visceral anger that motivates the alt-right, this sort of trolling tactics. They sort of make a brief appearance in this trial, and we don't know exactly how involved Thiel is in it, but it does give him an insight into how powerful those tactics can be. I mean, even Gawker would say that of all the enemies that it made, before it knew that Thiel was involved, that Gamergate was arguably the most dangerous and damaging. Gamergate puts in motion like a multi-million-dollar boycott from Gawker's advertisers. They sort of barrage it with controversy and complaints and comments, and Gawker's just sort of caught off guard by just the extremeness and the overwhelmingness of this sort of online mob. And you could argue that same playbook is then run against Hillary Clinton. Again, I'm not necessarily saying that Thiel did that, but I think when he was sort of looking at, you know, trying to pick a winner, I think maybe he properly estimated the impact that those forces were going to have. And you're right, it's not only Chuck Johnson, but it's Milo Yiannopoulos that's involved in the first anti-Gawker stuff. Mike Cernovich, who's another sort of big alt-right personality, Vox Day. It's a number of these people that we hear of for the first time protesting Gawker for, of all things, you know, ethics in video game journalism. And then the next thing you know, these people are, you know, on CNN constantly as Trump supporters.
Mm-hmm. Okay, so the thing goes to trial, and I think you can see that Gawker is increasingly surprised that it goes to trial, because at the end they start offering real money. They offer finally what, $10 million to sell? Yeah,
north of $10 million. Yeah,
and they're like, nah, we want the trial. And
well, there's a pivotal moment that Thiel sends either a note or a message to Hulk Hogan, and he says, you know, Gawker thinks this is kayfabe. And kayfabe is the wrestling term for fake, right? Professional wrestling is kayfabe. The outcomes are scripted. Everyone knows what they're supposed to be doing. And then Thiel says, but this is actually a shoot. And a shoot is when in a professional wrestling match, it turns into a real fight. The script is thrown out and it becomes a real wrestling match. And in some ways, I think that mirrors what happened here. Most lawsuits are a form of professional wrestling. I sue you for $100 million, you settle for $1 million, right? I say I want my day in court, really I just want you to apologize, right? And so no one is ever actually trying to get towards trial. And I think that was something that Thiel realized early on. You know, in the deposition phase of this, they find out that Gawker has actually never even been deposed. Gawker has been sued many, many times, but never been deposed. And so in some ways, what gives Thiel the confidence to reject those settlements, in addition to the mock trials that he paid for, is the realization that no one had ever actually tested this company in court. And I think he gravitates towards the kinds of things that people haven't done before. And so sensing that Gawker isn't going to fare well in front of a jury, he pushes this thing all the way into a shoot, right? All the way to an actual jury trial. And the jury is appalled by Gawker. And I mean, they deliberate 2 weeks of trial, they deliberate for 6 hours, they come back with $140 million verdict. It's and Gawker is stunned by this, and because I don't think they ever thought it could happen.
Yeah. Now, I have a question about Nick Denton in this context. Now he's British, right?
Yes.
Yeah. So he's kind of new to the to the milieu here.
Yeah.
The trial is down in Florida, which is Hulk Hogan country, and
Yes.
not a particularly cosmopolitan part of Florida.
No, Tampa.
And I just kind of think, I mean, since they had never actually been to trial, I just think there's something that maybe you tell me Nick didn't understand about our judicial system, which is that at the end of the day, you can talk all you want about the First Amendment, but it comes down to whether the jury likes you or not. I mean, that's an oversimplification. I should give jurors more credit, but it's a huge factor, whether who seems like the sympathetic character.
Well, look, this was not a jury of Nick Denton's peers. Let's put it that way, right? And I think it's a couple things. So one, I think there was some overconfidence on Denton's part. So there's some hubris there. I think there was also kind of a resignation. Like I think he'd sort of been the head. I compare him to Benito Cereno from Melville's Story. He's sort of a prisoner of his own ship at this point. I think that was part of it. And then I think he was not given particularly great legal advice. He spent something like $10 million litigating this case. I think repeatedly he was told his chances of winning were better than they actually were. He hires First Amendment lawyers, and they argue a pretty good First Amendment justification for this. But Hogan in Florida was arguing a privacy claim. He wasn't arguing does the media have the right to say whatever they want. He was arguing, was my privacy violated, yes or no? And those 6 ordinary people overwhelmingly felt yes. And then there's a further legal technicality that either Denton missed or their lawyers underestimated, which is that in Florida, civil verdicts are subject to a supersedious bond, which says you have to post the amount equal to the verdict in order to appeal to a higher court, capped at $50 million. So when they came in at $140 million, the Denton had to pay a minimum of $50 million to get this to an appeals court. And I think he thought maybe the judge would stay that bond, but when she didn't, it was sort of game over right then and there. And perhaps had his lawyers sat him down and better said, look, we don't think your chances are that good. Do you have $50 million? Are you willing to make a $50 million bet that that you can appeal this? If not, we should offer up to $49 million just to try to settle this thing. Okay.
And so then they've lost. They realize they're in trouble. They don't have the money on hand.
Right. Few do.
No, few do. I mean, Gawker had been very successful. We should emphasize. I think at one point you said it was worth $300 million, but that doesn't mean you have that much cash on hand. And he had started all these other sites, and he really, I mean, you have to give him a kind of credit. He captured a moment in the internet where no one else had really quite realized the possibilities in a certain realm, like snarky gossip. And Gawker was like the embodiment of snark. I mean, when that word gained currency, snark, Gawker was just thought of as just snark central.
Yes.
It in a way, if you wanted to trace the lineage, I would think of Spy magazine back in my day, like in kind of mid-late 80s, but Gawker was, pushing things way further.
Yes.
And so, it's relevant to the question of how much sympathy can happen. But we'll return to that anyway. After the trial, it is disclosed. I mean, you note that at first, there's not that much alarm about the precedent that's been set, even in the press. People say this seems to be confined to posting a tape of somebody having sex. You don't do that, you're okay.
Right.
And so there's not like a ton of sympathy for Gawker floating around. But then Thiel's identity is revealed.
Yes.
And people realize, wait, a billionaire can just say, I want to put an end to this company. because Gawker did ultimately have to dissolve. I mean, they had to sell the company, and it is no more. And so there was this sea change in the attitude, right?
Yeah, it's weird. We sort of we use the word precedent strangely, or at least in two senses in our society. There's this sort of legal precedent and then precedent generally. So the original, when the news first breaks that Hogan has won the case, the legal understanding of the precedent is somewhat narrow. Even an attorney for the New York Times gives a comment in a New York Times piece. It says, like, look, you can't run stolen celebrity sex tapes. You would have got sued if you'd run the Erin Andrews tape when she was recorded illegally through a peephole in her hotel room, just as if you can't do it to Hulk Hogan. So that's the original interpretation. And then Thiel's identity is revealed about 2 months later, and all of a sudden people go, what is the precedent of this? Well, the legal precedent remains unchanged, right? Who paid the legal bills does not change the legal precedent per se. But the larger precedent of, can a person with unlimited resources set about destroying someone using legal means, and because of those resources eventually find a loophole to go after them with? That is an alarm. That, to many people, that is an alarming precedent, just because I think we're seeing this generally now. The Atlantic just hired and fired that writer. Was it Kevin Williamson? Just as the New York Times hired and fired a female op-ed writer for some, like, we're seeing this thing where, if you really don't like someone and you really want to get at them, we have so much data on people now that you eventually find something. And so I think people are alarmed at the precedent of a billionaire setting out to explicitly destroy a media outlet, succeeding in destroying that media outlet, and then we go, okay, even if he did so with legal means, what does this say about the future of media?
Mm-hmm. So Thiel is suddenly apparently kind of backpedaling. He had been, privately celebrating, but now it's revealed. And then he sits down with Nick Denton, and they come to some kind of understanding. Now, do you think that the reason Thiel felt compelled, they come to an understanding that leaves Nick Denton with some money, which I guess they didn't have to do, probably.
Not
right?
really, yeah, right.
They leave Nick Denton with $15 million of his own. Do you think Thiel was motivated to sit down with him by the fact that Thiel himself was now on his heels? He was now the villain.
Yeah.
And to have an antagonistic Nick Denton for the rest of his life could possibly complicate his public relations situation.
Well, Nick posts an article after Thiel's identity is revealed, and it's, I think, in some ways brilliantly played. If you could argue that Denton was sort of asleep at the wheel for too long, once he does realize that Thiel's behind it, he sort of springs into action. He writes this article, and it says, basically it concludes with, Peter, you have your means, we have ours. And what does he mean by that? Well, he means that, you don't like things being written about you. We can write lots of things about you. We are you can't kill us all, basically, right? Mm-hmm. And so Thiel does sit down with him. But it's interesting. So if Thiel is motivated solely by revenge for being outed, it seems inexplicable that the actual person who wrote the article was left completely unscathed. Owen Thomas, who wrote that piece in 2007, he leaves Gawker a few years later and in no way is targeted in this conspiracy at all. So I think Thiel's larger motivation had been shutting down Gawker as an entity, and he found that this lawsuit or these lawsuits was the best way to do it. I'm not sure he was actually motivated by destroying Nick Denton as a person. And so, as it becomes known that, Denton is having to rent out his apartment to pay for his mortgage during the bankruptcy proceedings, AJ Delario, is shown to have like negative $22,000 in net worth, at the time of the verdict. I think Thiel shows a bit of heart and realizes, if I kick these people while they're down, I will look very, very bad. And I will be making an enemy who has almost nothing to lose And so it comes to be that all the parties are motivated to settle this. And actually, Nick is a remarkable person. You know, I would have suspected that he would have been very bitter and upset, but he was very detached about it. And when I talked to him, he was just sort of like, look, this happened. This was in the cards. I wanted to move on. I didn't want to be wrapped up in some feud with a person who who clearly cared about it much more than I did. So I think both parties were motivated to end this thing that had, at this point, taken up like 10 years of their lives.
Mm-hmm. Now, Denton, was it after this whole thing played out that he got interested in Stoicism?
I think so, yeah. So, I mean, Stoicism is the kind of philosophy, I mean, perhaps one might turn to Buddhism, but I think Stoicism is particularly poignant about, you know, disaster, losing everything, Seneca, one of the most famous Stoics, is exiled from Rome, and then recalled, and then basically exiled, and then executed. Epictetus is a slave who is also exiled from Rome. So there's this theme of sort of loss and the reversal of fortune that's very essential in Stoic philosophy. And so I think it's the kind of thing that people recommend to you when they hear, oh, our friend Nick just had this thing happen to him. So I suspect that's how that happened.
And is your sense that it's become an important part of his life?
I think so. And look, I happen to know for a fact that it's also become an important life of AJ Delario, who ran, in some ways, you know, Nick walks away with, you know, millions of dollars. He'd already been successful. You know, he moves to Europe where he was already a citizen. That's very different than, say, AJ, who's just the editor of this website who gets sued for it, who has a negative net worth going into the trial. You know, his life is more or less turned upside down. He's essentially unemployable after this. So I know for a fact that he's turned to that philosophy as well, as I think one naturally would. As you, again, even if the adversity is somewhat deserved or somewhat brought upon by your own choices, that doesn't make it less horrible. I mean, that doesn't make it less sort of gut-wrenching and difficult. And so you're going to look for some solace or guidance as you're trying to turn your whole life around.
Did you introduce AJ to Stoicism? Because at the end of the story, he sounds like a person who has not yet discovered Stoicism. He sounds like he's on the verge of a breakdown.
I don't think I didn't personally do it, but one of the reasons he was willing to talk to me when I reached out to him, we already knew each other from my sort of public relations days, but he had read my books. So he was open to talking to me because he was familiar with my other writing.
Mm-hmm. So, and as for the apportionment of like sympathy and blame, Gawker, you know, I was reminded how extreme some of what Gawker did was. So there was the case of I don't know if she was a teenager, young woman, having sex. She's drunk. She's having sex on the bathroom floor of, I guess, a bar, and they run the tape. Her father gets in touch with Gawker, says, "I'm begging you. Do you know what it's like to have your daughter?" You know, and so on. Yes. And they're like, "Screw you, buddy."
Right. And in fact, AJ is the one that does that to his sort of perpetual shame. I think he's haunted by what he did there. And so, yeah, it's there's sort of this lost cause mythology now around Gawker, which is inevitable when you lose in a war to a billionaire, which is, as you even said earlier, we go, oh, Gawker was this sort of mean and snarky website. But in fact, I think it was far beyond that. It was regularly mean and snarky, and then at times, or in a handful of instances, inexcusably cruel or even potentially criminal. And those were the instances that they ultimately were held accountable for. And so I think Gawker's argument, for instance, on the Thiel outing or the Hogan tape, or they outed an executive at Condé Nast, Gawker's explanation often was, oh, that was a long time ago. We wouldn't do that today, which, as you know, is not a legal defense. Just because you're different now, that might be that might be some mitigation in sentencing or in as they're determining the amount of the intentional infliction of emotional distress and so on and so forth. But that doesn't free you from culpability for your actions. And I think in some ways what we're seeing now, I think in this case and just generally, is people realizing, oh, wait, you can be held responsible for things that you said a long time ago or things that you did a long time ago. Yep. And I think that should keep a lot of us up at night. I mean, sometimes I think, what are dumb things that I said on the internet 8 years ago? And if I was forced to answer for them now, that would be a very difficult position to be in. And so in some ways, one of the lessons I wanted in this book was a sort of sobering, humbling thing for us to think about, which is like, would you want to be wrecked financially for an editorial decision that you made 9 years ago? That's tough.
And I think, I also realized in the course of reading your book that Gawker had done some commendable stuff. And,
sure.
and they were, in retrospect, they foreshadowed the Me Too movement. They were publishing some pieces that would fit into the kind of oeuvre sure. of the journalists who are now compiling the Me Too stories. And one reason is that the spirit of it, also in its defense, was largely to pick on, I don't know if this is a defense, but they largely picked on powerful people. They weren't kicking the downtrodden by and large. I'm not saying they wouldn't pass up a good sex tape to involve somebody who wasn't famous, obviously, but there was that spirit to it.
I think they saw themselves as always punching up. But as they became more powerful, that ratio changed. But you're right. Look, Gawker ran stories about Louis C.K. They ran stories about Bill Cosby. They ran stories about a number of other people who would be implicated in the Me Too movement. I mean, one argument is, well, if they ran it, why didn't it have impact then? And partly, I think that's because people were suspicious of Gawker's sourcing methods, and so that was part of it. But Gawker was fearless. They would run the things that other people wouldn't run, and a lot of times they were totally right, And so that's where this gets complicated. Should an outlet that got it right most of the time be sunk for getting it really wrong one time? I don't think there's clear, easy answers. I think it's really complicated. One of the things I realized is that for Thiel to do what he did here, he had to filter out those complications. He had to make this very simple in his head, that this was good versus evil, that they were exclusively the outlet that ran things like that tape of the girl on the bathroom floor, not that they were also maybe doing things that were, furthering the cause of justice or truth or fairness. And so in the way that Gawker had a simple narrative about who they were and what they did, Thiel had a similarly simple narrative, and it was a sort of battle between these two narratives that we saw in that courtroom.
Yeah. No, the sense is that who would you say understands people better, Peter Thiel or Nick Denton?
I would say it's interesting. Neither of them, I think, understand people generally. Like in a normal conversation kind of sense, part of what makes them as smart as that they are is that they are wired a little bit differently. But Denton had this sort of intuitive understanding, for instance, that people might threaten to sue media outlets, but very rarely did they have the guts or the resources to actually do it. So that's sort of an insight into powerful people. He was calling their bluff. And then on the other hand, Thiel is the kind of person who looks for the things that other people aren't thinking about. And part of what motivated him to do this was precisely the calculation that Denton had made, which is that most people wouldn't do it and were too afraid to do it, and that's why he should do it. So I think they are strange. I think they are both uniquely wired, and that gives them a familiarity into some things that most of us don't have, and a deep unfamiliarity with a lot of things that most of us take for granted.
I mean, the reason I asked is because I kind of got the sense that when Thiel first became outraged about what Gawker was doing, there was a kind of naivete about it. I mean, it was as if like, you mean people are like this? You mean there are like reporters who will play to people's base instinct. You know, there was almost that degree of shock. And I'm like, well, if you've been paying attention to the world,
yes,
you know that people will click on this kind of stuff. They like these kinds of stories. And journalists have always, some journalists have always tried to provide them within the bounds of propriety of that day.
Well, what's interesting is then if you flash forward 10 years or 9 years, when Thiel backs Trump, there's a similar naivete where he doesn't quite get why people are so disgusted and outraged by this. Not even at a policy level. It's that I think as a person who's been opposed to political correctness his whole life, he has trouble understanding where the sort of line is for most people. So what is repulsive to many of his Silicon Valley peers about Trump and why they would try to hold Thiel responsible for the things that Trump would say and do, I don't think Thiel fully takes into calculation and then is somewhat caught off guard when the news breaks that he's going to speak at the convention and then when he donates to Trump after the Access Hollywood tapes.
Right. It's almost like he's got a little Mr. Spock in him or something. Kind of, he's not only different, but doesn't understand the ways in which he's. I mean, with Denton, you know, you said that Gawker was accused of being sociopathic or psychopathic, and you could see arguing that Denton has no empathy, no emotional empathy, no concern for people's feelings, but he seems to get people by and large. With Thiel, I wasn't so sure.
Yeah, I think on the other hand, though, Denton might understand his peer group quite well, but I don't think he understood how he would come off to that jury in Florida. And so it's they both have these enormous blind spots. And again, I think what makes this story so Shakespearean and where I think there's almost lessons on that scale is it's as if their two blind spots collide together. Like you could not have picked two people who were more alike and yet more different and then put them into conflict with each other and created more sparks than what happened here. So it's sort of this, you know, historical anomaly that it's like the town wasn't big enough for the two of them. And that I think that motivated this in a large way. And so I was fascinated by that.
I mean, the other time I wondered how well Thiel understood people is when you know, Trump wins the election.
Yeah.
He has famously backed Trump and he's over the moon. Happy because like I made the right bet. And I'm thinking, I'm not sure you understand. You are going to be much more reviled for much longer because Trump won that election.
Yes.
Than you would be if he had lost and everybody forgot about it.
Yeah, I think logically he was thinking about it in terms of probabilities, right? Or he was if I bet this much, I have this much of a chance of winning. And actually, you know, you could argue he makes a similar calculation backing the conspiracy against Gawker. He's able to, in some ways, maybe overestimate his chances of success, right? In a way that he sees a chance of a favorable outcome that you and I might have judged as infinitesimal, and then underestimates what the costs of success is actually going to be. So he wins against Gawker, and yet pisses off the entire media system forever, or he wins with Trump and thus makes himself sort of permanently associated with the worst of Trump as a result. That those were both unintended consequences to him, but I think to me or to people near him, that was a pretty likely outcome that he discounted. And that naivete might be that might be usually an advantage to him. It just served him poorly in these two instances.
So do you think he's happier than he would be if he had not taken Gawker down?
That's a good question. You know, happy is not a word that I typically use to describe Thiel. I don't think that he's unhappy, but I'm not sure happiness is like the force. I listened to an interview once where he was asked if he was happy. And you could tell he was kind of flustered by the answer, by the question, and then sort of goes, well, you know, it depends on your definition of happiness. You know, he sort of is equivocating there. And that made me think that that's not kind of like if you ask me, I would say, well, it depends on the day, but for the most part, I definitely do think I'm happy. I at least, that is a metric that I'm thinking about.
Mm-hmm.
And the way his answer came off, it struck me that that wasn't something he's measuring for or optimizing for necessarily.
Mm-hmm.
I think so. I'm not sure he's happier, but I think he's proud of what he accomplished.
Mm-hmm. Now, and you think maybe Denton he's right when he says, look, I kind of wanted to, eventually made sense for me to get out of this racket and so on. You think he's pretty happy?
Weirdly, I would suspect that Denton feels a weight lifted off of his shoulders that Thiel wouldn't have felt by winning. There is sort of a freeness to losing everything, even if you were fighting against it the whole time. And so I think Denton is feeling that. And Denton packed up and basically moved to Europe. And so in some ways is just free of the insanity that has been U.S. culture the last 2 years as well.
Mm-hmm. So, both guys, as people tend to do, justify themselves in terms of the pursuit of high-minded ideals. I mean, Gawker justified what it was doing in terms of the importance of, the free flow of information, complete transparency, and so on. Thiel says, Gawker was a social menace. He wasn't just doing this out of revenge. You seem fairly charitable to both on those counts. I mean, you certainly at the end, you seem to accept to some extent Thiel's claim that he did this for the greater good. Is that basically your position? Because of course people, we all try to convince ourselves we do things for the greater good, even if we are just pursuing revenge or are just pursuing page clicks, right?
Yes.
But you take them kind of at their word.
Well, in a way, I think that comes from the Stoic practice, and I think this is a similar Buddhist practice, which is that you don't argue with other people's beliefs, right? In the sense that, like, why would I not take someone at their word about their own beliefs, right? I think in a weird way, that's a reflection of our culture, which is that when someone says something that we don't like, we don't argue with that. We argue with whether they actually believe that or not. Right? Or we argue with their intentions or their motivations. And so it doesn't strike me as that insane to believe that Peter Thiel believes that he did the right thing. Just as it wasn't that hard for me to come around to the idea, although I originally didn't necessarily think this, that the people at Gawker thought they were doing good in the world. It just happened that these two genuinely held beliefs came into conflict with each other, as is true in most conflicts, right? Socrates would say no one does wrong on purpose, right? Everyone thinks they're doing the right thing, and it's actually our certainty in that creates the most of the conflict of the world in the world. I would say.
Okay. Kind of final big picture question. I talked at the outset about how understanding the story might influence your allotment, your apportionment of blame, of sympathy, and so on.
Yeah.
Is there a way to summarize the way you feel about, Gawker, the institution, Nick Denton, Peter Thiel, and anybody else, Hulk Hogan, at the end of all this?
I was looking for good in this, right? And the good that I managed to take away was somebody set out to do something that had really never been done before, that people didn't think was possible, and he managed to pull it off in a time where I think we feel like the status quo is more or less permanent. Thiel managed to fundamentally change, both in a legal sense and I think in a cultural sense. He got us to think about our relationship with privacy and media in a different way. Like, the critics are going to argue there's a chilling effect, that the media now thinks about this before they write anything. And proponents are going to say, yes, people think about this now because they don't want to do something illegal anymore. And so in either scenario, you're arguing that Thiel did what he set out to do, which is change how we thought about this complicated issue. And so, this might be a stretch to some people, but to me, the lesson of the book was, here is a methodology outside the sort of normal playbook that can effectuate change. And I wanted to sort of leave it there. Like, I think people, it's interesting to me how opposed people are to Trump, how they'll call him Hitler or this or that, and then how little people are actually willing to do about it, right? I'm not talking about violence, but I'm talking about, people don't want to do anything but protest or sign petitions, right? And, what Thiel did was sort of realize, oh, that's not going to work. Here's how I'm going to do something about Gawker. And I think with the playbook he created here, you could sub out Gawker and put in someone or something else and perhaps effectuate a similar change of a similar magnitude in different areas that we feel we're stuck.
Mm-hmm. I mean, for my part, at the end of the book, I just had more trouble doing any kind of simple apportionment of blame and sympathy, which I think is progress. I mean, it's a complicated story. Humans are complicated. They pursue selfish ends and sometimes public-spirited ends, and sometimes the two are intertwined, and sometimes one is a disguise for the other, and sometimes it's not. And but it's it's good that at the end it's not a simple story of who was the good person and who was the bad person.
Well, that's right. And if Thiel had a naivete and if Denton had a naivete, the public has a naivete as spectators of these things, thinking that one side is completely good and one side is completely evil, when the truth is it is complicated. And as adults, we should understand those complications and sort of resist that simplification, because that's where we lose the ability to understand how things actually happen.
Okay. Well, anyway, really interesting book.
Thank you.
Conspiracy. Tell us the subtitle again.
Peter Thiel, Hulk Hogan, and the Anatomy of Intrigue.
Okay. And people can also find your stuff at the Daily Stoic, and you tweet at, as well as tweeting, have a daily Stoic feed. You have your own, right?
Yeah, at Ryan Holiday, and then my website's just ryanholiday.net.
And there's another book of yours that got a lot of it. You've written several books, but the first one that made me aware of you was the Trust Me, I'm Lying book, where you kind of confessed your past as an insidious public relations hack and revealed the tools of the trade.
No, what I was trying to do in that book is show sort of how the sausage gets made. And perhaps if we wouldn't have eaten so much sausage over the intervening years if people had listened, and perhaps we would be in a very different place right now. I mean, I think if anyone understands how media manipulation works, it's our enemies at this point, or it's people who are trying to cause disruption and chaos, and we're sort of stuck in a pattern right now that we can't get out of it.
Mm-hmm. Okay. Well, again, thanks a lot. Good luck with the book. You deserve success.
Oh, I appreciate it.
All right. Take care.